Bit of a fun story. Last year at CanJam Singapore, it was the first time for me to meet many of the newer manufacturers of high-end IEMs. So I'd go up to the table and I'd ask if I could listen with their flagship IEMs. And I'd say, will this do? And I'd pull out Apple's little USB-C dongle DAC. And they'd be like, maybe not. And I go, just kidding. And I pull out my Hugo 2 and 2 Go stack, which I had with an Enlium HPA23 RM amp, making for a $6,000 system to use with their IEMs. Now, most of the audio world is not that crazy. Don't look at me. Most people are going to be using something like Apple's dongle DAC, and for most people it is pretty fine. I mean, if you are listening with something like these $100 IEMs from FiiO Audio, which I have in for review, and if you want to see that review, don't forget to subscribe and be notified when that is coming out, or even just FiiO's FX17s, well then maybe Apple's dongle DAC actually can do pretty decently. But what if you have something like these FX17s, or maybe even some of the full-sized headphones that I have sitting behind me, just to note that they're not all mine, I'm not that rich. Then something like this dongle DAC, not only is it not really going to have enough power, it's not really going to get that loud. So in that case, that's when you start to get into more serious gear. Maybe you start to get into better portable players or better portable devices. And then maybe if you want, especially to drive headphones, then you have to get into serious desktop gear. So then you need an amp. Okay, right, I'm going to get an amp. And then of course you need a good DAC to go with it, because you need to have something to supply good digital audio. Right, and then what if you want to EQ? Well, then you have to sort out software EQ, or maybe software EQ isn't going to be so good with something like this Bifrost, so you might then get a Lokius. And there you have a desktop stack, which is considerably bigger than, it's not quite the same size, and it's pretty substantial. But lately, makers of portable audio gear, such as this Cayin RU9, which I reviewed recently, have been making substantial gains with the quality of their portable audio components, and now they're starting to get quite serious in what their capabilities are. And the latest of those is FiiO's QX13. And for a device only the size of my thumb, this thing has some substantial power, 600 odd milliwatts of power output if you just connect it up to a phone, but you can also connect it up externally to another power supply via the side port, or even FiiO's optional battery, and you get up to 900 or odd milliwatts of output power, and it does get considerably louder than Apple's little dongle DAC. And that's starting to rival some of the desktop systems that, like this one that I've stacked behind me, and even some which are considerably more substantial. Not quite, but considering this thing is only $220, it's pretty scary what they could cram in here. And yes, it has a built-in programmable EQ system so that you can customize it towards whatever headphones or IEMs you have and set it up appropriately. It even has a control app so that if fiddling with the menu system is not too appealing, you can actually do it via your smartphone and program it as necessary. And it even has this cool little display showing the output power that it's using for your headphones. And if you need to connect it to something like a gaming console, you probably saw the little UAC sign at the bottom there. You can set it to UAC 1 mode, and you can connect it to a gaming console or even Windows 7 if you're one of those people. So it works perfectly well with a computer, phone, gaming console, or what have you, if you can connect in via USB. And of course, for headphone output, you have a 3.5mm socket and a 4.4mm socket. 4.4mm being a balance socket that completely separates out the left channel and the right channel so that there's no crosstalk between the two channels, and that gives you a little bit better audio quality, although the 3.5mm socket is perfectly fine. So let's start going through all the capabilities that this thing has and how it compares as not just a device for listening with headphones and IEMs in general, but also how it compares with some of the other dongle DACs I have on hand, including some which are quite well known. One of the most significant features of the QX13 is the external power option. So you'd normally connect it up, say, using its included USB cable, which, being that it's fancy copper and probably is not going to be to USB spec, and a cable that's not to USB spec is probably worse than one that's braided with copper. But anyway, for this kind of length, it probably doesn't matter. Anyway, you connect that up to your phone, and then if you can get more power from your phone, if you don't mind very quickly draining the battery, you can actually switch it into desktop mode with it just using whatever power you have, especially useful if you're just connecting it directly to a computer. But if you want external power, either from the battery that's available from FiiO, which I don't have, or I'm going to plug it into just a regular charger, then you have basically an external power source, which means you will not end up draining the battery of, say, a portable device. Now it says side port connected, as you see, and then you can switch in the desktop mode, and there we go, desktop D mode on, and that gives you more power and more gain because the volume goes up about 4 decibels. I have the 120 step setting on, but that gives you half decibel steps. But there is a 60 step version which gives you full decibel steps. So I remember it was 4 clicks in that mode between the levels. But it gives you, I guess, more gain. And how that works out in terms of sound, now it's certainly a very clear, a very detailed and very resolving little dongle DAC, and actually quite capable. As we said, it has 600 milliwatts of output, which is pretty substantial as things go, but also 900 if you have external power plugged in. Now, when I was going to Tokyo last month, and if you haven't already seen it on here.audio, I have a write-up of about 20 IEMs and headphones that I tried at the earphone Portafest, or Portable Audio Festival in Tokyo. It's like a can jam, but run by probably the most famous shop for headphones and portable audio in Japan, earphone. And I went there for the 2 days, and I was deciding, should I take the RU9 or should I take the QX13? And in the end, I don't have the battery for the X13, and I know I end up draining my phone's battery all the time because it does double duty, taking video as well. So I took the RU9 because it has a battery. And the RU9, of course, has external power as well. And one of the reasons, of course, for having external power is that batteries are limited in how much instantaneous current they can deliver, which is why, for example, if your phone's battery is deteriorating, it can end up crashing because the phone can't draw enough power for, say, graphics or whatever. In the case of audio, it's having enough power for transients in music. And so even if you do have, something which is a lot of, 600 milliwatts of power, well, there's only so much it can draw instantaneously from your phone's battery, and it will probably run things down. So having external power is a useful option. In terms of sound, actually it's a useful example. The RU9 is on the warmer side, even in solid state mode, and the QX13 is on the, I would say, people say colder or analytical side. It's definitely an evolution of a typical FiiO ESS based device. And that means it was probably maybe the coldest or most analytical sounding of the devices I tried. I was kind of on the edge of whether this was actually more resolving or about the same as the RU9, which is currently one of my favorites despite its simple design and a couple of limitations. Now, KA17, I think it was FiiO's CEO who said that it would be if it had a QX number, it would be QX11. Now, the KA17 is still a pretty capable device, doesn't have as much power, but noticeably there was a distinct jump up in resolution from the KA17 to the QX13 at the same volume level. There was definitely more nuance to instruments, note decay, and the subtle sounds of acoustic instruments on good quality recordings. More significantly is the effect of the desktop mode. Now the desktop mode, of course, it gets louder. Does it sound better? Well, with the KA17, I don't think it did. The sound with desktop mode on, you see that's the last thing I used it with, it tended to sound thicker. And then once I did the volume adjustment thing, it's the same kind of issue on here, then I found that it just sounded thicker. It didn't sound more resolving. It didn't sound necessarily better. And I actually left desktop mode off on it because I think it sounded best without desktop mode on. With the QX13, however, once I did the volume match thing, I felt that there were subtle improvements, especially with more demanding things like headphones with the desktop mode on. So it gave a little bit better, slightly better dynamics, slightly better resolution, slightly better everything. It wasn't a dramatic difference, but I think it was with especially more demanding gear, and I did use this with headphones. That's where desktop mode was definitely superior. Now, but how did that overall desktop mode on or off compare with other devices? So definitely a step up from the KA17 with good music and good gear, distinctly noticeable, even if the tuning is pretty much the same. And that's the thing, if you have something with a very similar, we'll say tuning, I don't want to go into too much into the rabbit hole of the subtle differences between electronic gear, then it's harder to notice differences, whereas we tend to notice, of course, different headphones obviously sound different. It's very noticeable. So having that difference in resolution, to me, was significant. Now, another one, the BTR17. And the BTR17, I'd say, is probably one of FiiO's best devices they have made to date. And it doesn't have as much power as a QX13, but it does have a battery. And you're probably wondering, why didn't I consider taking the BTR17? Yeah, actually, I did think maybe I should have tried that instead of the RU9. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But anyway, interestingly, I thought the BTR17, people have said it's a little bit warm. I thought it sounded fairly neutral as things go, but probably my kind of center point between warm and cold is probably a little bit lower than what most people tend to have. It depends what you're used to, of course. Interestingly, the BTR17 sounded slightly warmer than the QX13. The QX13 sounded a little bit sharper. That was interesting because I'd expected them to be either similar or the QX13 to sound warmer, if at all. But no, it was a BTR17 that was slightly warmer and slightly lower in overall power output, which was significant as well, especially with desktop mode. And that was probably most noticeable with full-sized headphones where you want more gain. And I do torture test things in ways that are probably not so normal for regular usage. Because with IEMs, of course, a QX13 or any of these devices are going to be fantastic. More than enough power. And maybe the differences, of course, might be in resolution or slight tuning, whether you have warmth and how much warmth you can switch into something like a RU9, which you need to do EQ for if you're using the QX13, which I'll talk about in just a sec. The BTR17 is, of course, slightly odd because it's actually designed as a Bluetooth device primarily. You can see it has a case which has a clip and a place to hang things, etc., etc. And it has the nice clicky wheel, which I wish the QX13 had. But I'd probably say that the QX13 was maybe slightly better in general overall performance. So it depends on if circumstances mean that Bluetooth is better, then BTR17 is going to be a better option. But still, of that sound, there was still a slight sense of the old ESS DAC sound to the QX13. So generally pretty good overall, but some instruments at some moments sounded a little bit, well, like they're going through an ESS DAC, a little bit harsh and edgy, just on the occasional note. It actually did pretty well, but you still noticed it from time to time. But if you don't have an ESS DAC in there, well, how does that go? Well, I have a couple of dongle DACs which I can compare with, and one courtesy of a friend who has lent me his IFI GO Bar Kensei, which I just have to polish because that's just a fingerprint magnet. Starting with the good old W4. The W4 is a really excellent dongle DAC. But it's starting to show its age a bit, especially, and its price at $450 odd, $449 or something, versus the $220 of the QX13. The W4 has the equivalent of 4 Cirrus Logic DACs in there. It actually does have 4 Cirrus Logic DACs in there, and is pretty excellent as far as resolution goes, as far as a little dongle DAC goes. And it has a clicky wheel. Sorry, I just have to do this. I just wish that just always feels so good to use. But even ignoring all the sophisticated features that are in a QX13, I found them near identical in terms of resolution. And if we ignore power for the moment, because the QX13 just has the advantage of having more power available, I'd probably say they were pretty close, with maybe the very subtlest difference between the W4 sounding like something with a 4 Cirrus Logic DACs in it, which is what I said in my review, which you can actually check out, by the way, and the QX13, which has that slight ESS edginess occasionally. And of course, there are differences in the analog circuits, and yeah, it was pretty close enough that I'd say, well, a QX13 is just destroys it in value. But still, I mean, I have a lot of affection for the W4 as a really fantastic device. Then, IFI's GO Bar Kensei, which is a little bit of a different one. It is a Cirrus Logic DAC-based dongle, even though IFI tends to use Burr Brown. You cannot fit a Burr Brown DAC inside something this size. They are just massive. So the Kensei is interesting. It has a few interesting features like extra bass and extra space, and it has the K2 thing, which adds harmonics to CD quality odd music. And actually, I pretty like it, and I found them very comparable in sound with the GO Bar, depending, of course, on which filter you select, sounding a little bit on the warmer side, whereas, of course, the QX13 was a little bit on the colder side. In terms of features, of course, the QX13 wins out massively, and also the fact that this thing is a brick. I know there's a regular GO Bar, which is not this heavy, But the Kensei is pretty monstrous and expensive. It's up there in price with the W4. Value-wise, the QX13 demolishes it as well, although I do have very comparable in sound, although, again, those subtle differences and those subtle extra harmonics make the Kensei pretty nice. You don't need the IEM match in something like the QX13, as I discussed. And the only there are some little small niggles I have where you can accidentally switch filters and things by bumping the buttons on the side. It has its advantages and disadvantages, and it's just the weight is not something you can easily attach to your phone without some kind of external pouch. So I'd probably say overall, as things go in terms of, sound, it's probably somewhere we're looking at cold to warm. I think we're on this kind of arrangement with the that's somewhere in the middle. That leaves the QX13 pretty impressive as things go. The only where it tends to have its limitations, and this is the same with all dongle DACs, is with full-sized headphones. So running it with, I wanted to hear how much detail it could resolve, and tried it with Dan Clark Audio's Expanse headphones, which is, you don't usually buy a 220 dongle DAC and say $4,000 headphones, although this being small, it can fit inside the case. But those headphones tend to have low impedance and somewhat low sensitivity, and I found that maybe at higher volumes, while this did keep things together, and I listen at about 70 to 80 decibels depending on the music, I could get, if I used a -0 dB, that is full output 1 kilohertz signal, I could at maximum volume get 112 odd dBs out of the QX13, and I think it was 114 with the RU9, and no one would listen that loud. I just wanted to hear how much power it could how much volume it could output with full-sized headphones. Listening with the QX13 and starting to turn up the volume towards maximum for music which demanded that, I'd probably say that due to the limitations of the amount of power reserve something this small can hold, that it just wasn't going to sound as wide as a full-size desktop amplifier. And the reason for that is simple: capacitance. Inside a full-size desktop amplifier, you have capacitors. And so those capacitors hold power in reserve for things like transients. Basically, size matters in that case, and you can only fit very tiny capacitors in something this size, especially as there are 2 circuit boards in here. And so that's where its limitations are, and while it held it together, it obviously was not going to be as dynamic or as clear or as open sounding, effortless sounding as a full-sized desktop amplifier would be. But still, it held things together pretty well. It didn't lose composure, and I know FiiO, like Cayin, do not allow enough volume output to allow their devices to go into clipping, which is where things would start getting damaged. Now, in terms of tuning, I mean, we talked about the RU9 in its review, where you can switch in the tube modes and you have slightly warmer or even more warmer with the classic tube mode, and things become more intimate as the crosstalk increases. But for everyone else, they're going to go, no, why don't you just use EQ? And well, yes, you have 10 programmable EQ presets in here, which you can use via a Chrome-based web browser. And I found this very useful, for example, with something like FiiO's own FX17 IEMs. Now, these have a kind of V-shaped tuning, which is not my particular preference. And the treble is too sharp, for example, and the bass is a little bit too overwhelming. So I wanted to bring up the mid-range primarily with them, and so I could program in a preset to do that. The only problem with that is that I found I boosted the 3 kilohertz, 2 to 3 kilohertz range, and I also wanted to drop the 8 kilohertz peak, well, basically the peak 6 to 8 kilohertz region, to reduce the sibilance that I heard on music. Now, reducing the sibilance was okay, but boosting the mid-range up 3 decibels, well, that led to digital clipping, and that was only 3 decibels, because I was listening to a track, and I forgot what it was, something fairly modern that's fairly compressed and already close to -0 dB. Normally, when you engage the EQ mode, it drops the sound, I think it's 6 decibels from memory. And that means if you are already getting close to maximum volume and you want to use the EQ, then you're going to run out of volume for you. That's going to be one of the detriments of EQ that people don't talk about. Now, the fact that I only lifted the mid-range 3 decibels and it started going to digital clipping, so I think it's fine for, say, a low bass boost, if you want a little bit of a bass boost. I think it's fine if you want to, say, get rid of some annoying peaks. But I think if you start boosting ranges to get, say, better mid-range like I did, that's when things start to fall apart. So in the end, though, I actually, if I hadn't been sick and I hadn't not been able to shoot video, I would have probably given this the 2025 product of the year because it encompasses so much of what FiiO does and in a really tiny device. If you do have one, do post some comments and let me know how you went with it. If a few people do watch my video, to check out what other people are saying about the products they own. And do let me know and let everyone know your impressions and your experience and any tips you have. And as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you either online or at CanJam.